much for joining me today. I'm Samie. There are a ton of great speakers, so I really appreciate you taking the time to geek out with me. I want to level set with everyone. We had a few technical issues, so I am going to ask that we hold until the end before I answer any questions. My moderator, Ryan, is going to try and come off mute and field those to me, but just a heads up, we're going to wait till the end for Q&A. I also like to throw out there, because sometimes when I start talking about creating documentation, I feel like there's a little bit of an elephant in the room. And that is because of this line right here from the Agile Manifesto. It is totally normal to have mixed feelings about documentation, ranging from I love it to you will drag me kicking and screaming through this documentation process. I, for one, love documentation, and I am happy to be joining any documentation haters today in this virtual format where I don't have to dodge Rotten Tomatoes or anything else you might aim to throw at me. So I believe, and I think many people believe, Agile was never meant to be anti-documentation. However, it was meant to break this cycle of building extensive documentation and solving problems on paper before actually building your product. I believe that well-done documentation supports your team by unlocking tons more efficiency throughout the Agile process and by making it easier to collaborate and communicate cross-functionally with businesses and product side nerds like me. So, how does documentation support working software? We are all familiar with the Agile framework and the emphasis that rather than building documentation at the beginning of a project, more aligned to a waterfall methodology, or at the end of the project once everything is buttoned up, thinking of documentation as a layer throughout this Agile methodology is the way to go. As you continue to iterate, documentation provides your team with all the context that they need to revisit the purpose of their work, remember key decisions, and understand what was built and why. A key benefit is time savings. A study published by Covio articulated that 60% of employees are juggling at least 4 sources of data and information each day. Half don't even know where to look to find some of the information they need to get their job done. Meanwhile, project management tool Asana recently published a stat articulating that the average worker spends over 100 hours per year in unnecessary meetings. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel like I spend about half of some of my recurring meetings just recapping what happened in the prior meeting and reorienting the team to make progress and move forward. Improving our documentation of key decisions and conversations has helped make the meetings that we do keep on the calendar more effective. Last, our friends at Atlassian found that 96% of companies have faced a significant gap in knowledge after a long-term colleague's departure, primarily because they weren't documenting key processes. Documenting the core functions and processes of your team will keep each sprint running smoothly, regardless of things like vacations, emergencies, reorgs, or new hires. Having a culture that prioritizes documentation is going to keep your team moving in the right direction, not bog it down. And we all agree here in Agile land that the right direction is toward building great software. But that takes time and effort, and it is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are tons of best practices and processes that I'm going to throw at you as recommendations, but I'm only going to talk about 2 tools for building great documentation today. The first tool is Confluence. If you know anything about me, you know I'm always itching to talk about Confluence. I am a massive Confluence nerd. And Confluence is the perfect pair with Jira. This might be a little one-on-one or 101, but in case you missed it, there are a few key features to keep in mind. You can create new Jira issues directly from Confluence, or the opposite, create new Confluence pages directly from Jira. When you link Jira issues in Confluence, they also automatically update to reflect their current status. This makes Confluence the ultimate place for documentation for teams that are using Jira. Seriously, if you're trying to manage your documentation anywhere else, you are missing out on a really powerful integration. But again, I'm assuming this is a little bit 101 for this crew. Just know you have great features and great tools at your fingertips. My second recommendation is that you add a diagramming tool to Confluence. You guys know I am a Gliffy gal through and through. Gliffy is fully embedded and makes it easy to capture your ideas or processes, aka create documentation, in a visual format. I'm not going too deep here, this is not a sales pitch, but rather let's dive into some great times and places to invest in your team's documentation, and then you'll see where Confluence and Gliffy can play that role. When you are starting out with no documentation or poor documentation, building it from scratch feels like a lot to tackle. We are all working in this fast-paced industry together, often on teams that are stretched thin in our day-to-day work. If you can pick just 3 places to start, here are a few spots where I would prioritize spending a few extra minutes on documentation. First, ongoing strategic and cross-functional discussions. Think about that important vendor or partner you meet with monthly, or maybe like a cross-functional or full team meeting. You might be taking your own personal notes during these meetings, but I would recommend using Confluence to create a shared document with other members of your team to capture notes from these conversations on an ongoing basis. This does 2 things. It lessens the burden for a single person to manage tasks and takeaways from that engagement. It also makes it easy to keep key stakeholders in that conversation aligned, because if I can see that one of my peers took a note that doesn't align with my understanding of the conversation we're having, I can work with them to make sure we get back on the same page. There are 2 other quick benefits. First, this ongoing record can be a little bit of a CYA, cover your ass, that holds you and your teammates accountable should any issues arise. Second, I feel like the first few minutes of many meetings were spent going over what was happening in the last meeting. So this way of capturing your discussions in a shared place and on an ongoing basis keeps everyone aligned and makes it easy to catch up where you left off. Anything we can do to reduce those 100 hours of unnecessary meetings. In Confluence, you can do this by creating a page that captures running meeting notes over the span of a quarter or any other period of time. Make sure to give other stakeholders edit access so that you can share that burden. Then, another bonus benefit, your product owner or project manager can go and automatically create or link Jira issues straight from that page. This makes it easy to connect the issue to the context or the request that it comes from. Second, key decisions. I use the Confluence page template for this all the time. When you are making a big decision for your team or your product, like a price change or maybe a team structure change, it can feel like the details you're facing are absolutely unforgettable. You've had this spreadsheet open to try and calculate the revenue or the profit of your decision on your computer for the past week. You've been dreaming about this decision, or worse, losing sleep over this decision. But I had a reality check a few years ago when I was working on a major yearly initiative for a retailer. It was my 2nd year in a row on this project, and all the details that helped us reach a decision and a strategic direction in year 1 were not so crisp in year 2. And it made it a lot harder for us to iterate on our work and evaluate what worked and what didn't from the prior year. What I learned from this is that documenting key decisions means you are giving your team and your organization the opportunity to learn. And that's the whole point of this iterative process in Agile. Capturing inputs from stakeholders, outlining the risks between those options, and linking to any documents that aided in your decision-making process is a must-do. Remember that stat about people not knowing where to look for information? Just don't do that to yourself. We recently used the decision-making template in Confluence here at the Gliffy team to decide whether or not to participate in some of Atlassian's server end-of-life initiatives. Nobody freak out, I said server. I think it literally saved over 2 hours of executive level time on our team. I compiled materials from Atlassian and tagged all the stakeholders in on one page. I asked everyone to review those documents and populate their inputs on the page by a certain date. Everyone could see the edits as they rolled in, and then we used 10 minutes of an already scheduled meeting to go over that page and make sure we were all aligned on a final decision. This process saved time, and it gave our global teammates the opportunity to contribute their thoughts, regardless of their time zone. Now, when my boss's boss inevitably pops over to my desk and asks why we're offering dual licensing discounts, I have a single source of truth. And when one of her peers asks our sales leader why we're offering dual licensing discounts, they're going to show them that same document. Everyone can see those edits, everyone can see the inputs, and we have our rationale documented. Even when we look at our financials in 2025, whether I'm still in this role or not, they will have the context they need to understand why we made the choice that we made. Now, that was a super cross-functional example because that's the type of work I am doing. But giving your engineering team this framework to document decisions like how something is built, changes to your application architecture, or other key investments will go a long way, especially when it comes to onboarding new team members. Last, we have to document structures and processes, which I think is primarily what we think of when we think about documentation in this industry. But it's also easy to dismiss. Isn't the code itself good enough documentation? Understood. I hear that, but getting things like network and software topology, database structures, and application architectures all outlined makes it so much easier to onboard a new team member and minimize the impact of losing key knowledge when a teammate takes off. That leads me to one definition here for you guys: tacit knowledge. Knowledge management nerds like me like to throw this term around. This is the stuff that you know how to do because you've done it before, and maybe you've experimented and found a shortcut. Think about this like a recipe. Your mom may have made brownies with that same recipe for years and given you the recipe. But maybe she forgot to mention that a few years ago, she once didn't have enough butter. So she put in some butter and then added some olive oil. And maybe she liked the brownies better when she made it that way. So now she just deviates from the recipe every time and adds a little olive oil. Without knowing that, your brownies will never be quite the same, even when you follow the recipe. And that really sucks if you're homesick or you're missing your mom. Adding a little olive oil instead of butter in this case is tacit knowledge. And tacit knowledge is bad for agile teams. If you want your processes to run smoothly and consistently so that you can iterate without hiccups, you need to make that tacit knowledge explicit knowledge. And that is via very clearly documenting your structures and processes. Some of your tenured employees or teammates may find this obnoxious or even feel threatened, like sharing their secrets and their tips makes them replaceable. So this is where managers and leaders need to do a good job of creating psychological safety if it is a priority for them to create a culture of knowledge sharing. That is no small task. And honestly, I can't speak to what that should look like for your team, but I think Atlassian has created a ton of great resources in their team playbook, so you should totally check those out. Now, with those 3 recommendations of things to focus on, I wanted to overlay this conversation in the context of the Agile methodology specifically. It's important to know that documentation takes place throughout this process, and your documentation should be describing what you are building or have built, rather than prescribing what you should build. That would be way too waterfall. The requirements phase is obviously a key time to get your team aligned around a goal, but again, we're not documenting exactly what's being built here. It's more about the product organization describing and documenting why the work is valuable. This could be things like user stories. Those are a key deliverable to the software team during the requirements phase. But I believe good documentation can go beyond that too. I want my teammates to have a ton of great context for the work we're doing. So capturing research in things like empathy maps or story maps can capture the insight and the thinking behind the job to be done. Documenting your user research and requirements validation data helps give every member of your team the context that they need to develop a truly successful solution. The requirements phase can also be a good time to use a really high-level UML diagram or flowchart to document the intended flow of a solution. But again, this should be directional for the team, not overly detailed or prescriptive. Keep it high level. The design phase is another pulse point to invest in a little documentation. Capturing the physical and logical aspects of what you're building supports collaboration across teams, and improves communication with your business stakeholders. Visual documentation like C4 models, data flow diagrams, or UML diagrams can be great resources throughout the development process. And giving your team the tools to make this work visual is more aligned to problem solving or sketching on a whiteboard rather than assigning another writing chore. This is one thing, or the one thing you should consider capturing in writing is your rationale for some of the design choices your team makes. And we've already discussed the value of capturing major decisions in a formal format. The testing phase is a great time to make sure you have documented some standard processes. Creating a testing strategy document and plan is a must-do to ensure you're continuously delivering high-quality releases to your customers. Building a traceability matrix is also a great best practice to ensure your test cases align to the requirements documented earlier in the development process. And, of course, you're going to want a standard way to document your test results. This is one place where I think Jira and Confluence integrated together is particularly powerful. If you want to ensure consistent, high-quality tests, consider adding visuals to your testing documentation. Your team does not want to read a wall of text, and Atlassian's own research finds that pages with visuals, like diagrams, receive more engagement than pages without. This is kind of a no-brainer, but just make the type of documentation your team will not dread using. Likewise, creating documentation outlining your deployment processes ensures that your end users consistently have access to a great product. Every team member should be aware of their specific responsibilities and how they fit into that process as a whole, as well as timing for those activities within that process. This is where a process flowchart can go a long way, and it clearly communicates the roles and responsibilities and supports faster onboarding. Ideally, your team is building and creating and refining documentation as part of this continuous development cycle, and this way, documentation is not a massive project or undertaking. Rather, it's something you can instill as simply how your team completes work. I think one of the most common problems with documentation is that it is not maintained, so it is not used, so it is not prioritized. And this is this terrible catch-22 situation. Do not go schedule a massive let's document everything project. Like building new habits, it is better to take this one day at a time and one step at a time. I really believe that creating and valuing documentation is part of a team's culture, and you cannot change organizational culture overnight. When I studied knowledge management as part of my MBA at the University of Minnesota, we actually talked about building a culture of knowledge sharing as a process that takes on the scale of years, not sprints and certainly not days, years. So please think about all of the scenarios and options that I've shared as places to start. Then, regardless of where your team is investing first, there are 4 best practices that I'm going to share that your team can get behind to start building documentation that you will actually use. Make it a healthy, sustainable habit. Your documentation should be organized and accessible. And I firmly believe that Confluence is the ultimate place to build a strong culture of knowledge sharing. Having used other tools like SharePoint, I have struggled with keeping information organized and accessible. We still use SharePoint sometimes here at Perforce, and my teammates know it is the bane of my existence. I can never find anything. Next, consistency. When you use the same pages, the same templates, the same structure, it instills confidence for the users of your documentation that they will know where to find information and know what information is consistently available within that documentation base. So think about what you can do to build consistency. One of the best tips there is using Confluence templates. Next, clarity. I am a writer by trade. I can be long-winded. I regularly ask ChatGPT to help me make my emails shorter. That is not what good documentation looks like. Nobody wants to use or read a massive wall of text. So as you're working with your team or with your teammates to build documentation, capture the details you need. Don't capture anything you don't. It's not a homework assignment. There's no word count goal. Work on striking that balance between what information is valuable and what information can be removed. Last, give your team the best tools to capture their ideas and refine them. Give your team ways to create documentation that aren't writing. Because again, I'm really comfortable with writing, but I think I'm in the minority of folks there. I highly recommend diagramming add-ons like Gliffy so that your team has multiple methods of sharing ideas. As I mentioned, Atlassian found that pages with visuals are more engaging. So creating documentation that's actually engaged with means you're doing a good job. This is my only hard pitch in the presentation. If you need a tool for this visual documentation element, check out Gliffy Diagrams for Confluence on the Atlassian Marketplace. You can sign up for a free trial. We do have a Jira app available as well, but within the context of creating long-standing documentation, stuff that your team is going to reference again and again, Confluence is where we really shine. Pitch done. So now my challenge to each of you is to pick one spot within your current workday or workflow to start building and sharing documentation with your team. This could be testing the decision-making template in Confluence for your next big decision. It could be building a deployment process page or refining it before your next product release. It could be refreshing or restructuring some existing documentation to make sure that it is accurate and accessible to all the stakeholders in your organization. Or it could be outlining what you intend to build with a UML diagram or a flowchart. As we shift into Q&A here, I'm curious where you will start. And now we can try and take questions. So Ryan, I'm curious how you're doing over there.
Good. Great job, Samie, by the way.
Thanks.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome. We do have one question. We have a question here that says, can you please share some advantages of Gliffy over whiteboarding, a whiteboard tool?
Sure. Yep. So Whiteboards, as many of you are aware, is currently available in beta, I believe. And it is a super cool tool that Atlassian themselves are building. There are a couple instances where I think Gliffy is going to continue to shine over that native functionality that's being built into whiteboards. Obviously, we're just playing with the beta. I don't have any sneak peeks there. But Whiteboards has some pretty basic functionality for pulling in Jira data and capturing like basic flows. When I talk to Gliffy customers, they show me diagrams that give me goosebumps. I had someone show me a diagram a few days ago, and they said, this is the diagram I'm known for here at my company. And it was this massive, tangled web of processes. They had layers that they were toggling on and off. They had links out to different data repositories. It was massive. And so I think right now the key benefit of Gliffy is that it is going to support those technical use cases and support you building some of those larger processes out living on the Confluence page. Whiteboards, I think, is really exciting for its deep integration with Jira and showing those issues. And I'm excited about seeing where that investment is going to go. But for Gliffy, what I can say is that we're going to continue to keep an eye on the bigger, meatier use cases of process diagramming, architecture diagramming, those types of elements. Did that answer your question okay? I hope so. I actually don't know how you'd respond.
Yes, thank you. There we go. Samie, I don't have any other questions currently, so if anyone else has questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we can certainly answer those. And give it another minute or so.
Also, hey, Jamel, thanks for being my bodyguard. Just catching up on the chat. Thank you, guys. If there aren't any other questions, I highly recommend hopping over to some of the sponsor booths, chatting with folks. Gliffy is not a presenting sponsor this year, just hopped in to nerd out with everyone. And this is my first JiraCon, so thank you for joining me today.
Samie, could you talk about automating Jira ticket production from Confluence? I don't know if that's
Oh,
something.
okay. Automating it, I actually don't know how to do that. At a very basic level, the feature allows you to select text and then an option that says create issue pops up and it links the Confluence page into that Jira issue. In terms of automating, I can take that offline and do some Googling to try and help you out. I think that came from Jennifer. Yeah. Jennifer, I'd love to dig into that with you. And thank you, Chuck, for the help there.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, interesting. Thank you, Dan. You're more of an expert than I am.